A few things to point out compared to last week when it comes to raids. This was the performance of last week. You can see that Affliction Warlock, Windwalker Monk, Unholy DK, Feral Druid, Balanced Druid, Outlaw Rogue, Fire Mage are basically still there. They just, swapped around a little bit. There has been the slight improvement of Elemental Shaman in the last 2 weeks, but when we look in the last week, we can see that Elemental Shaman is now here. Now, what prompted this improvement? Well, if you have watched my last videos, here and there, you might have noticed that I was waiting for a certain legendary. Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence, the last world boss available, dropped this legendary, which is very powerful in single target. So this is what is prompting this sudden increase in performance from Elemental Shamans. When you look also at the single target specific bosses like Shriekwing, like Artificer Zymox and Hungering Destroyer, which are the easiest to look at in Mythic because they are the one with most logs, the one with most representation of classes and specs, you can see that Elemental is doing very well. Even later on, a heroic boss like Sludge Fist, which is also pure single target, you can also see Elemental Shaman doing very well. So this is the main change in the last week, the acquisition of a very powerful legendary for Elemental Shaman. The other difference that we have to still point out, even though it didn't change in performance, is Windwalker Monk. The reason why we have to point this out is because, it's continuing to do very well, and, this is where we started. This is where Windwalker Monk was at the start. The particularly interesting thing about all of this is being in awe at how quickly people are to reroll to a Flavor of the Month spec. Because currently Windwalker is on the rise. They passed Enhancement and Feral in logs, and they are now chasing Retribution, Subtlety, and Outlaw. So they are in the middle of the pack, and they are trying to get into the top half now. So it's truly impressive how quick people are in changing their specs whenever they meld some Flavor of the Month hiding somewhere. Now, talking about raids, we also have to mention a few things about progression, because progression has kept roughly to be 40% slower than Uldir. Now, looking at the numbers, the participation of players and guilds and logs in this tier is actually higher than Uldir. Even when you look at the participation in Mythic Plus, it's also higher. Even more circumstantial evidence like 50% more traffic on Warcraft logs this tier compared to Uldir. However, despite this increased traffic, despite this increased participation, the progression remains rather slow compared to the previous tier. So we have to go back to the original point that is made every time I go and talk about this, which is item level, gear, loot. If you have less loot, you're gonna have more trouble bypassing certain bosses that require you to have a DPS check or a HPS check. So you have to wipe more, you have to spend more time on the boss, and therefore the progression will be slower. I don't think mechanics-wise the current bosses that have held up stopped most guilds, most very good guilds, top 300 or so guilds, which is currently Council of Blood and Inerva and Sludgefist. I don't think they are more complicated than bosses like Vectis or Mithrax, and yet the progression is pretty slow in comparison. The actual question regarding all of this is what will Blizzard do in the next year, and or if for them this is okay. Are we going to get things like tokens, things like extra loot? Are they going to revert the loot scarcity in Mythic Plus, increase the item level, increase the drop rates in raids, or are they okay with this space of progression? That will be the question. When we look at Mythic Plus, we also have a couple of changes. The first thing to point out in Mythic Plus is this. Up to this point, this was the current situation of Windwalker Monk. This week, this is the situation of Windwalker Monk. When we go and look at the plus 15 and up, this is Monk. So similar to raids, of course, Windwalker Monk is getting more representation, more and more, by the day. In Mythic Plus as well. They have passed both Warrior and Havoc Demon Hunter, and they are currently sitting at the third most used melee DPS spec, behind Outlaw and of course Unholy DK. The other thing is that we have to continue monitoring the situation, the duel between Restoration Shaman and Restoration Druid. This current week sees Shaman holding strong. As a matter of fact, they increased by 1.3% compared to before. And if it was possible, it was difficult, but they made it. Mistweaver Monk is even less popular than before, as well as Holy Priest. Whereas Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Druid remain more or less the same. So the really mean Restoration Shaman has siphoned away even more healer slots from Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk to become even more used. When we look at tanks, I mentioned DKs and Druid being probably the worst ones for a Necrotic week and their inability to kite. Although, to be fair, DK can handle Necrotic by themselves. This week, Vengeance Demon Hunter becomes even more popular, and there is a noticeable and predictable increase of almost 20% compared to before from Protection Paladin, and there are multiple ways of getting rid of Necrotic, on top of the fact that they are also, a lot of them, Kyrian, so they have even more ways to get rid of Necrotic. Protection Warrior, I would be happy if I were them, only losing 0.1% in popularity. They are holding strong, solid representation of Protection Warriors, and then pretty much literally nothing changing for range DPS. It's the exact same as before. People look for marksmanship and fire mages, and if they can't, then they're going to slot in a balanced druid. The last option, the last possible option is going to be either Affliction Warlock or Shadow Priest. That's the current state of Mythic Plus. So noticeable increase of Windwalker Monk, and a decent and predictable increase for Protection Paladin as well. Restoration Shaman continues holding strong. They have fended off the attacks of Restoration Druid, who is going to be doomed, I think, fighting with Holy Paladin over time for their popularity. Now, when it comes to the actual dungeons, the harder ones and the easier ones, and how this week as a whole has been with Tyrannical and Inspiring and Necrotic. So my guess was that this week would have been harder to climb on all keys. You know, if you're a 10 player, it's going to be harder for you to get to 13. If you're a 13, it's going to be harder to get to 15. And if you're doing 17s, it's going to be harder to get to 19s. It has been more or less like this, less high keys compared to last week. And this is also a negative because you have more loot now. You are progressively getting more and more loot, so it should get progressively easier. Instead, this week, we have less. Yes, there is one day and a half left to the week, but it seems unlikely that it's going to catch up. When it comes to harder dungeons, now this is getting a little bit annoying. To repeat this every single time, Mists of Ternaseeth and Halls of Atonement are the easiest dungeons. At this point, it basically doesn't even matter what affixes they have, if it's fortified or if it's tyrannical. This week, if it's inspiring with necrotic, it doesn't matter. They're just undertuned dungeons. Now, in the last couple of weeks, a new dungeon has joined them. This has been after the round of massive nerfs to the trash of Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension is also amongst the easier ones now. Yes, of course, it's tricky when you go into Spires of Ascension and you have to fight the Goliath or even the Inquisitor and the Justicar without being able to CC or interrupt anything, but luckily, most of the mobs that are going to get inspiring in Spires of Ascension can be CC'd, and they also happen to be very squishy. There is no bolstering, there is no fortified, so they die very quickly, so you are able to just CC one and just kill the pack, AoE the pack as usual, which dies very quickly because it's not fortified, and then take out the last one alive that you CC'd in the first place. When it comes to the middling dungeons, we have Theater of Pain. Theater of Pain has been middling. I called it middling since the first week I looked at data, and it has remained a middling dungeon. They have gotten 56,000 completed keys between 10 and 14, and then almost 6,000 completed keys at 15 and up. Theater of Pain this week is rather easy for most of the dungeon, with the exception of Gorechop, which is your melee blaster. And the problem with Gorechop is that he summons two little shits constantly, and the little shits are going to apply necrotic, so it becomes a problem. Luckily, the little shits can be CC'd, and he also gets stuck, basically self-stunned into his cast rather often, so the tank can find ways and rooms to drop the stacks. Inspiring is not that dangerous in this key, particularly if you have Dispel Disease, so it doesn't make it too dangerous overall. The surprising one that is actually not as hard as previous weeks is going to be the other side. The other side has gotten 62,000 completed 10 to 14 keys, and over 6,000, 6,100 completed 15 plus keys, more than Theater of Pain. The surprising part comes from the fact that the bosses are still pretty tough in the other side, but a possible explanation to this is the fact that a lot of the trouble on the other side bosses comes from the fact that they were DPS checks. Once you get more loot, and once you get more gear, and you can blast them much faster, and you can also scale and stack buffs on top of each other, like for example Prideful, with maybe even Bloodlust, you can bypass a lot of the problems, a lot of mechanics problems of a fight, for example Domina on Plagueful, which we will see soon. The other thing is that the other side doesn't have very nasty necrotic stacking, constantly necrotic stacking bosses. One of the tank busters is going to be the Millhouse fight, but because they switch places, because they also have some casts, it's rather easy to drop necrotic stacks. Dealer Zayaxa also does her own casts for the explosion, which basically guarantees your necrotic stacks to drop very easily, as well as, of course, the last boss, Moezala, has its own combo of attacks, which is going to guarantee you dropping necrotic stacks as well. So the other side on Tyrannical is not very easy by itself, but necrotic, let's just say, doesn't make it too much harder. When we talk about the actual hardest dungeons, is going to be the trio of Sanguine Depths, Necrotic Wake, and Plagueful. Sanguine Depths, beyond getting 45,000 completed 10 to 14, only has 3,600 completed 15 and higher keys. There is not a single plus 20 completed yet. It's also one of the few dungeons that doesn't have a plus 20 completed, and only currently 2 plus 19 dungeons completed in Sanguine Depths. Of course, Tyrannical is an issue on Sanguine Depths, particularly the middle bosses, because the more annoying part of a Tyrannical boss is when there is a lot of damage coming in and you can't really do anything about it. There are certain mechanics that you simply have to be good and dodge. And then there are other mechanics, like in Sanguine Depths, which you simply have to tank. You have to man up and take it to the face. Executor Tarvold, of course, people by this point have gotten to hate his Castigate ability. They have lengthened the cast of Castigate, but they haven't made the circle any smaller, which is also one of the main problems, as well as the AoE you are forced to eat whenever the fleeting manifestation is summoned. This encounter has a lot of must-take damage, not much you can do to avoid. Talking about avoiding and must-take damage, Grand Protector Berelia is the same thing. Whenever she does her AoE that you have to protect yourself by taking up the fragments, it's still gonna do a ton of damage in Tyrannical. As well as, of course, her iron spikes on the tank, which hurt a lot. Luckily, which is what doesn't make this dungeon the hardest, on Berelia it's pretty simple to drop the stacks of Necrotic. On General Kyle is also pretty simple to drop the stacks of Necrotic. So overall it's not the hardest, but it is definitely an annoying one. The actual two hardest are going to be Plagueful and Necrotic Wake. The interesting point about Plagueful and Necrotic Wake is that players have way more trouble completing these keys in the 10 to 14 range than they have in the 15 plus. 15 plus range is low, but not the lowest. Sanguine Depths is winning. Necrotic Wake and Plagueful are in the 4 to 4,500 range, but the 10 to 14 clear rate is low. Lower than 40,000 for Necrotic Wake, 47,000 for Plagueful. And this is what happens when you have annoying trash and annoying bosses. And it just so happens that some of the affixes of the week make these very annoying to deal with. Inspiring in Necrotic Wake is awful. It is awful because, for example, the Zolramus Necromancer is going to have Inspiring in Necrotic Wake, which means you cannot kick the skeletons using Frostbolt Volley, which is a problem. Luckily for you, this is Tyrannical, but still, it hurts a lot. Another even worse thing is going to be in the Necropolis. The Necropolis has now driven 74% of all tanks that went in there mad. In the Necropolis, you're going to get trash packs with Corpse Collectors with someone else in the pack having Inspiring, which means the Corpse Collector is going to spam his Gore Splatter, AoE damage, and his Drain Fluids completely uninterrupted. Necrotic also has the problem in Necrotic Wake that there are a lot of small guys. This isn't a problem in and of itself. They die pretty quickly, you can kite them. The real problem is that this is not a fortified week. So what you would want to do normally is grab these together with a bigger pack. Use your cooldowns maybe, take them all at the same time, which is made considerably harder when all these little shits are going to slap your tank and get into 70 necrotic stacks very, very fast. And you can't even chain CC them, because if you're making a big pool, you are almost certainly also picking someone up that has Inspiring, so they can't even be stunned. So it just makes it very annoying to deal with. The bosses themselves are not too bad in Necrotic Wake with Necrotic. It's just a combination of both, of Inspiring and Necrotic, which make Necrotic Wake very annoying and the hardest of the dungeons this week. The other one is going to be Plagueful. Plagueful, as I mentioned, like Necrotic Wake, has way more problems apparently in the 10 to 14 range, so in the more pag range, let's say. The problem of Plagueful is not the trash, has already been nerfed in Plagueful, significantly actually, so Inspiring doesn't really worsen the key. What worsens the key is Necrotic and Tyrannical. The first boss in Tyrannical is still a decent DPS check. It has been nerfed in HP by 10%, so it's not as bad as before. And Necrotic on the second boss and on the last boss is not that much of an issue either. It does become an issue though on Domina. The problem with Domina is that she basically has no gaps, no pauses in her melee auto attacks. You know, other bosses are going to have some sort of RP summon, RP channel, some change of phase, which is going to allow you some breathing room as a tank. Domina doesn't have that. The Brood Assassins are basically summoned automatically, and you just have 1.5-2 seconds window when she's using her Cytotoxic Slash on the tank. So it does become extremely difficult to deal with her, particularly because also the Brood Assassins can start applying necrotic stacks. Now, the Brood Assassins can also attack the party, so it's not that bad if you're getting a necrotic stack as a healer or a melee or a ranged DPS. 1, 2, 3, even 10 stacks on you are not an issue. The issue is when they target the tank, the issue is when you pick them up all together, and then the tank grabs aggro and he gets a fuckload of necrotic stacks. On a tyrannical key, the higher you go, you will start being forced to go through 3-4 of these rounds of adds, and it becomes exceedingly difficult to deal with this. This is one of those fights where you start looking at specific specs as well as specific covenants, unfortunately, to deal with this. Because of course having a paladin or even a tank paladin, and then of course looking at Kyrian with the Vial of Serenity being able to remove necrotic stacks, it does severely trivialize this fight compared to how dangerous and difficult it can be if you don't have any of these tools. So, with this, we close the part of Mythic Plus after looking at both the specs and the current dungeons and how they're looking in this week. Now, in closing, lore bits have been exposed to us in the last couple of days. One is the audio and the dialogue from Bolvar for the Twisting Corridor quest. In case you're unaware, the Twisting Corridors are basically going to open to us next week. And then there is the cinematic about Sylvanas and Anduin. I don't want to express myself on this because I hate Anduin and what has been done to the character by she who shall not be named. Let's put it like that. So before you all start simping for Sylvanas, I don't want to hear it. I'm going to leave you like this, okay? See you guys soon. In the meantime, I don't know, find Sylvanas' OnlyFans account.